The sound of Big Ben reverberates throughout London, marking 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It echoes around Clarissa's drawing room, where she sits, feeling annoyed. Why did she have to invite people to her party whom she simply didn't like? Mrs Marsham had written to Clarissa saying that Ellie Henderson wanted to come. Didn't Mrs Marsham understand that Clarissa was well aware that Ellie wasn't invited? Ellie was such a bore. Clarissa is also feeling frustrated that her beautiful Elizabeth is currently shut away in her room with that nauseating woman, Miss Kilman. She's such a judgmental prude and quite ridiculous with her mackintosh and umbrella. And what were they praying for at this hour? Hey team, just a reminder, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel out, and our next upload could be on something taught in your next class. Thanks, and back to the video. Clarissa hears the door being opened, and in comes Richard, holding out a bunch of roses. Richard had mentally prepared this afternoon to tell Clarissa that he loves her, yet in this very moment, he can't bring himself to say the words. But Clarissa seems to understand. Richard draws Clarissa to the couch, and they catch up on all that has happened that day. Peter Walsh's visit, Miss Kilman visiting Elizabeth, and Lady Bruton's luncheon. Richard holds her hand as they chat, and feels that this is the height of happiness. But their conversation shifts as Clarissa frets about the party. Richard does not want to disparage her, but he makes a mental note. If these parties are rattling Clarissa's nerves, he will not let her throw them anymore. As Richard prepares to leave for an important meeting, a question niggles in his mind. Does she regret marrying him? Does she wish she married Peter instead? Clarissa watches Richard leave, feeling content and admiring the way he lets her have her freedom. He then returns with a pillow and a quilt, declaring that she is to have an hour's complete rest after lunch. She thinks these little gestures of affection are particularly adorable. And yet, as Richard departs, Clarissa feels her mood shift again. Why does she suddenly feel so unhappy? She remembers Peter's disapproval of her parties. And even Richard doesn't seem pleased by them. Why do they criticise her? It's so unfair. Reassuring herself that Richard is just caring for her health, and Peter is always judgmental anyway, Clarissa feels her contentedness return. After all, she throws parties to celebrate life after the war. But what did life really mean to her? Was it to fulfill a higher calling of bringing people together? If anything, Clarissa's parties are her way of making an elegant offering to the world. Elizabeth opens the door quietly, knowing that her mother is resting. Clarissa, watching Elizabeth stand perfectly still at the doorway, admires her beauty. But her view is soured by Miss Kilman standing sternly in the hallway, eavesdropping, as always. Miss Kilman always wears this drab mackintosh. It is cheap, and she is over 40, no longer feeling the need to impress anyone. She is poor too, so poor that she has to take jobs from people like the Dalloways, who like to treat her like a charity case. While Miss Kilman didn't mind Richard, who was often kind, she despises Mrs Dalloway. She considers Clarissa the most worthless of all women, rich, with little culture, and preoccupied with her expensive things. If anything, Miss Kilman is convinced that she is perfectly entitled to whatever the Dalloways do for her. Besides, she has a higher calling. 2 years ago, Miss Kilman remembers how she had embraced religion. She'd turned into a church and heard Reverend Edward Whittaker preach. She was so moved, perhaps by the music or the sermon, that she had wept uncontrollably. Her feelings of anger and rage were replaced with peace, and she had never been the same since. To be fair, Miss Kilman doesn't think she hates Clarissa Dalloway. Rather, she pities her for being nothing but an empty fool. Only she could make Clarissa cry, ruin and humiliate her, so that she could see the truth of life, or at least make her realise a higher purpose and meaning. Clarissa asks what their plans might be for the rest of the day. Miss Kilman replies that they are going to Army and Navy Stores, a department store in London. And as Miss Kilman and Elizabeth start to leave, Clarissa is seized by a violent urge. She leans over the banister and urgently reminds Elizabeth about the party tonight. Now that Miss Kilman is finally gone, Clarissa realises just how much she hates her. She despises her sense of superiority and everything she stands for. What did Miss Kilman know of love and religion? They only destroy the privacy of the soul. For instance, Peter Walsh was supposedly in love. But who was he in love with? Only some vulgar and trivial woman. And he could never stop talking about himself, for goodness sake. Passion only degrades a person. Big Ben rings out the half hour, and Miss Kilman listens to it, thinking of Clarissa Dalloway. That ugly, shallow woman had actually laughed at her. How humiliating. Miss Kilman simply cannot afford to be glamorous like Clarissa Dalloway. No clothes seem to suit her, and her forehead looks like an egg, bald and white, no matter how she styles her hair. Her only indulgence is food. Miss Kilman follows Elizabeth into the Army and Navy Stores. As they browse through the petticoats, Elizabeth wonders whether Miss Kilman might be hungry. On cue, Miss Kilman pipes up that they should have afternoon tea. Elizabeth can't help but watch Miss Kilman as they eat. It's a bit obscene the way she looks again and again at the plate of sugared cakes on the table next to them. Then, when a lady and child sit down and the child takes the cake, Miss Kilman becomes infuriated. She wanted that cake, and with eating being the only pleasure left to her, she is not going to be denied it. Elizabeth asks if Miss Kilman will attend the party tonight. Miss Kilman only replies that she never goes to parties, the reality being that Miss Kilman is never invited to parties. Miss Kilman feels her own insecurities swell within her and is overwhelmed with embarrassment. She can feel Elizabeth, this beautiful girl, being repulsed by her. She feels ugly and terribly unhappy. Miss Kilman reassures herself that at least she has her education and her very respectable knowledge of modern history. That was something. What an awkward exchange. Elizabeth, feeling the need to escape, excuses herself. She must return home in time to prepare for the party. But Miss Kilman does not let her go. She insists on finishing the last of her tea and chocolate eclair. So Elizabeth waits politely, but clearly under duress. As soon as Miss Kilman finishes her second cup of tea, Elizabeth leaves. Miss Kilman watches Elizabeth go and is seized by gut-wrenching despair. Elizabeth had gone. Clarissa Dalloway had won. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stands on Victoria Street waiting for an omnibus. She feels free. The fresh air is so delightful after the stuffiness of the Army and Navy Stores. Sitting at the top level of the omnibus, she feels like the figurehead of a ship, her hair slightly messed by the wind. On such a beautiful day, Elizabeth decides to go to the Strand. She thinks about her future. Miss Kilman is always encouraging her to choose a career. And since all professions are open to women of Elizabeth's generation, she fancies being a doctor, or perhaps a farmer. She could even go into politics if that was her calling. Strolling down the Strand, Elizabeth feels quite proud of her independence. But she feels that her mother probably sees her as immature, and she certainly wouldn't like her wandering off alone like this. Chastened by this thought, she decides to turn around and walk back up the Strand. Having had enough adventure for one day, Elizabeth calmly boards the Westminster omnibus. Meanwhile, Septimus Warren Smith lies on the sofa in the sitting room, watching the same afternoon sun that Elizabeth Dalloway was enjoying. Retzier watches him smiling to himself and feels again the crush of loneliness. This is not a marriage. It isn't right for her husband to look so strange, to be randomly speaking, laughing, and sitting silent, hour after hour. He keeps telling her that he knows the truth, and keeps prompting her to listen carefully for it. Yet she can never hear anything. Retzier decides to continue making a hat she'd started earlier, even though it's too small for the lady she'll gift it to. When Septimus makes a funny joke about the hat, they both laugh. Oh, what a joy! Septimus seems like his old self again. Retzier feels, for the first time in a long time, that she can say anything to Septimus. They are happy again. But suddenly, Septimus remembers what Sir William Bradshaw said to him about how he must be taken to a country home, and that Retzier can't stay with him. Who was Sir William anyway, to make such decisions on his behalf? Retzier had explained to him that it was because he had threatened to kill himself. But is Septimus so powerless now that he can't decide where and how he recovers? He looks at Retzier, who is now tying up his writing and drawings he'd done during his episodes. He wants her to burn them, but she thinks some of the drawings are beautiful. Then she sits next to him, and in that moment, he sees her as a flowering tree, protecting him with her branches. She will triumph over Dr. Holmes and Sir William Bradshaw, these horrible, rich men who made such harmful, contradictory judgments. Retzier gets up to pack their things in the bedroom as they plan to leave together to outrun the grasp of Dr. Holmes, when a sudden noise downstairs stops her. It sounds like Dr. Holmes has decided to visit, so Retzier runs downstairs to prevent him from coming up. She must stop him. But Dr. Holmes simply moves Retzier aside and blunders up the stairs like a bully. Septimus imagines him bursting through the door and seizing him. But no, Septimus will not stand for that. He considers the gas fire, but would that take too long? Could he use the nice, clean bread knife? No, he can't spoil that. There before him is the window, his only option. But isn't that a bit too dramatic? Besides, Septimus doesn't want to die. Life is good. But now Holmes is at the door. Crying out his final rebellion, Septimus jumps from the window ledge and down onto the area railing below. Retzier and Dr. Holmes hurry to the window and look down. It's clear to both of them that Septimus is gone. A big commotion starts up as their landlady, Mrs Filmer, collides with Dr. Holmes and tries to hide Retzier's eyes with her apron. Dr. Holmes returns, looking white as a sheet, and holding a glass for Retzier. He reassures her, convinces her to drink the sedative, and settles her into bed. As Retzier dozes off, she remembers Septimus's life and what he went through, having survived the war. She sees Dr. Holmes and recognises him for what he truly is: menace disguised as help and salvation. Where does this leave Retzia? And will this tragedy be felt by anyone who attends Clarissa Dalloway's party tonight? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.